So, let me introduce myself. I'm Max, and I've lived in the same sleepy little village my entire life. Not much happens here, really. You've got the old Henderson farm at the center of town, kids playing near the stream, and the local diner where you'll find half the town gossiping over coffee. It's a quiet life, but it's mine. Things were predictable, at least until the Hendersons decided to sell their farm. That place was a landmark, practically a piece of history around here. No one thought they'd ever let it go. But they did. And to strangers, no less, rich ones from the city, with big plans and even bigger egos from what I'd heard. The day they moved in was a spectacle. Black SUVs rolling through town like some celebrity entourage. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. You'd think we were in the middle of a Hollywood movie. I remember standing by the diner, coffee in hand, when one of the SUVs pulled up next to me. The window rolled down, and there she was, Mrs. Hatfield. She looked out of place here, with her designer sunglasses, perfect blowout, and an attitude that practically screamed, "I'm better than you." She asked for directions to the farm, her tone clipped like she couldn't be bothered to care. I pointed her in the right direction and figured that'd be the last I'd see of her. Boy, was I wrong. A week later, I found her stranded by the side of the road. Her fancy car had a flat, and she didn't seem too pleased about it. I stopped to help because, well, that's what you do out here. But the way she acted, like it was my fault the tire went flat, rubbed me the wrong way. Still, I changed the tire, and she barely muttered a thank you before speeding off. The whole encounter left me uneasy. Something about her didn't sit right with me, and I wasn't the only one who thought so. The locals couldn't stop talking about the Hatfields, speculating about why they'd come here and what they planned to do with the farm. Rumors started flying about their intentions. Some said they were going to turn it into a vineyard, others thought a luxury retreat. Whatever it was, it felt like a storm was brewing. Little did I know, my life was about to get a whole lot more complicated, not just because of the Hatfields, but because of something closer to home. But I'll get to that. For now, just know this. The quiet life I'd always known was starting to unravel, and it wasn't just the newcomers stirring things up. There was trouble brewing in my own backyard, too. While the town was buzzing about the Hatfields, my buddy Timothy Burns was facing a storm of his own. Tim's the kind of guy you'd call salt of the earth, reliable, honest, and maybe a little too trusting for his own good. He's been married to Candy for about 8 years, and from the outside, they seemed rock solid. One afternoon, Tim called me over, sounding off. Said he'd found something strange while doing the laundry. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this had him rattled. "Max," he said, sitting on his porch with a cigarette he wasn't even smoking, just holding, "you ever seen anything like this?" He held out a shirt, one of Candy's. There were these strange stains on it, makeup smears, but not hers and something else. At first, I didn't want to believe what he was implying. But then he pulled out her phone bill, pages of late-night calls to a number he didn't recognize. "You talked to her about it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Yeah, and she lied," Tim said, his voice tight. "Said it was work calls. Thing is, the number belongs to her boss. Makes you think, doesn't it?" I didn't know what to say. Tim was one of the good ones, always faithful, always working to keep his family happy. If Candy was stepping out on him, I didn't see how he'd handle it. Later that night, he called me again, his voice shaking. "I found pictures, Max," he said, "on her laptop. Pictures of her and her boss, and it's not just him. There's another guy, too. Some guy I don't even know." I drove over to his place, but when I got there, Tim was already spiraling. He showed me the pictures, evidence so damning there wasn't even room for denial. He'd confronted Candy, and she doubled down on her lies, then flipped it on him. "She said I've been distant, that I'm the one who pushed her away," Tim muttered, pacing his living room like a caged animal. "What are you gonna do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear his answer. Tim stopped pacing and stared at me, his face unreadable. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I can't let her keep making me feel like this." The look in his eyes chilled me. There was heartbreak there, sure, but something else too. Anger. A kind of fury I hadn't seen in him before. As Tim's world was crumbling, Johnny found himself on a similar path. Johnny's one of those guys who seem to have it all. Top salesman at the local dealership, married to Jessica, a woman who could light up any room. From the outside, they looked like the perfect power couple. But lately, Johnny had noticed things weren't adding up. It started small. Jessica's work hours at the real estate firm were stretching longer. Late meetings, she called them. She'd come home distracted, brushing off his questions with excuses that sounded more rehearsed than real. And then there was Mark Diamond, her boss. Johnny first noticed how she'd mention Mark in passing, like it was nothing. Mark said I crushed it in today's meeting, or Mark's been so supportive. At first, Johnny didn't think much of it. But then, she stopped saying his name altogether, referring to him vaguely as my boss. That's when his gut started screaming something was off. One night, Johnny caught her smiling at her phone. He asked what was so funny, and she practically jumped out of her skin. Just work stuff, she said, locking her screen and slipping the phone into her pocket. That was when Johnny decided to do something he never thought he'd do: install a few surveillance devices around the house. I know it's crazy, he told me at the diner. But I can't shake this feeling, Mac, something's not right. I didn't know what to tell him. You sure you're not overthinking this? I asked. I hope I am, Johnny said, stirring his coffee with a shaky hand. But if I'm not? A week later, Johnny called me late at night, his voice tight with anger. I got the recordings, he said. You were right, maybe I was overthinking it. But now? Now I know. Jessica had been taking calls with Mark at home, calls that weren't about work at all. The way she spoke, the laughter in her voice, the things she said, it wasn't the kind of talk you'd expect between a boss and employee. I confronted her, Johnny told me. She denied everything, called me paranoid. Said I was ruining our marriage with my suspicions. What did you say? Johnny let out a bitter laugh. I told her I'd ruin a lot more than our marriage if she kept lying to me. While Tim and Johnny grappled with their suspicions and confrontations, another story was unfolding in the background. The fiancé, no name needed, just a man caught in the worst kind of limbo. He'd been engaged for nearly a year to a woman he thought was his forever. But lately, he'd been noticing the kind of changes you can't ignore. It wasn't anything obvious at first. She was just different. A little more distant. A little less affectionate. She's been pulling away, he admitted one day over a drink at the bar. I ask her what's wrong, and she says it's just stress. Work deadlines. Family drama. You name it. I nodded, not wanting to jump to conclusions. Sometimes people go through rough patches, I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. I'd been hearing too many stories lately. Yeah, but this feels different, he said, swirling his glass. She's hiding something, I can feel it. But when I ask, she turns it on me, says I'm being paranoid. I'm not the paranoid type, Mac. He wasn't, and that's what made it so unsettling. This guy was steady, level-headed, the kind of person who'd give you the shirt off his back without a second thought. If he was feeling off about something, there was probably a good reason. That's when he told me he'd hired a private investigator. I don't want to be that guy, he said, almost ashamed. But I can't live like this, wondering if I'm just imagining things. What did the PI say? I asked. Not much yet. Said he's gathering evidence. But he already found out she's been meeting some guy at a cafe downtown. Same guy, same table, same time, every Thursday. That hit me like a punch to the gut. What are you gonna do? He sighed, rubbing his temples like he hadn't slept in days. Wait for the proof, I guess. I need to be sure. But if it's true, Max, his voice broke off, and for the first time, I saw a flash of anger in his eyes. If it's true, I'm not going to let her walk away from this without knowing exactly what she's done to me. By the time the fiancé was waiting on proof, another storm was brewing, this time with Jenny and Deegan. Jenny was always the bright one in the room, the kind of person whose laugh could lighten the heaviest mood. Her husband, Deegan, was the quiet type, solid, dependable, but not exactly the life of the party. They balanced each other out in a way that seemed perfect. But Jenny was carrying a weight no one saw coming. It started when I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked tired, her usual spark dimmed. You okay, Jenny? I asked, trying to keep it casual. She hesitated, her hand hovering over a carton of milk. Max, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, can I talk to you about something? Of course, I said, though I wasn't expecting what came next. She confessed right there in the aisle, tears welling up in her eyes. I cheated on Deegan, she said, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. It was a work trip, a stupid high-pressure situation. I don't even know how it happened, but it did. I didn't know what to say. Jenny, of all people? She was the last person I'd have ever pegged for this kind of thing. Does he know? I asked finally. She shook her head. Not yet. I don't know how to tell him, Max. He trusts me so much. I'm his whole world, and I've ruined everything. I could see the guilt eating away at her. You've got to be honest with him, I said. He deserves that much, doesn't he? Jenny nodded, but I could tell she was terrified. What if he leaves me? She whispered. What if this breaks him? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that she couldn't keep it buried. Secrets like that had a way of coming to light, and when they did, the damage was always worse. A few days later, word got around that Deegan hadn't shown up at the diner for his usual coffee. The regulars noticed. People talked. And then I saw him, sitting alone at the park, staring at nothing. I walked over and sat down beside him. He didn't look at me, just kept staring straight ahead. She told me, he said quietly. What are you gonna do? I asked. I don't know, Max, he said, his voice hollow. How do you come back from something like this? How do you even start? I didn't have an answer for him either. While Deegan was trying to figure out what was next, another story was bubbling under the surface. It was about a guy who preferred to stay in the background, someone I barely knew outside of a passing wave or nod. But his life, too, was unraveling. It started with something small, like most of these things do. One night, he was cleaning the bathroom when he noticed something out of place, a birth control pill backing tucked behind the trash bin. That might not sound like much, but his wife Caroline had been on an IUD for years. They'd agreed on no pills, no surprises, just sticking to what worked for them. He told me about it at the hardware store. I thought it was old, he said, like maybe it fell behind the bin ages ago and I just hadn't noticed. But he couldn't shake the feeling. He decided to check the trash more carefully. That's when he found another backing, and then another, all from the same month. Caroline wasn't taking these pills for herself, they weren't part of their agreement, and she hadn't said a word about it. What did you do? I asked. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I asked her about it, he said. She looked me dead in the eye and said they were for a friend at work. That the friend was too embarrassed to buy them herself because she's having an affair. And you believed her? I asked, not trying to sound judgmental, just surprised. Not at first, he admitted. But she kept saying it, over and over. Even started crying about how I didn't trust her. I felt like I was going crazy. But he couldn't let it go. Something about her story didn't sit right. He started watching her more closely, noticing the way she'd flinch when her phone buzzed or how she'd step outside to take calls she used to take in front of him. Finally, he decided to dig deeper. He checked her phone while she was in the shower, something he'd never done before. What he found changed everything. There were texts, hundreds of them, with someone named D. The kind of texts you can't misinterpret. Plans to meet, inside jokes he'd never heard before, and photos that made his stomach turn. He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he started gathering everything he could, screenshots, saved messages, even checking the pill schedule against the dates she'd been meeting D. By the time he was done, he had a mountain of evidence. What are you gonna do now? I asked him as we stood by the paint aisle. I don't know, he said quietly. But I'm not going to let her make me feel stupid. Not anymore. While the man with the birth control mystery was carefully piecing things together, Rick was dealing with a revelation that hit him like a freight train. Rick's a broadcast engineer, the kind of guy who can fix just about anything. Except, apparently, his marriage. He'd been with Sharon for over 15 years. They had their ups and downs like anyone, but he'd always thought they were solid. At least, until the night he heard something he wasn't supposed to. Rick's story started on a Sunday, the kind of lazy day where you'd expect nothing to go wrong. Sharon had been at church, as she was every week. Rick didn't go as often, but he didn't mind her faith. It was part of who she was. When she came home, she seemed off. Distracted, like she had something on her mind but didn't want to say it. That night, Rick stayed up late working on a project for the station. Sharon had gone to bed hours earlier, but he heard her phone buzz on the kitchen counter. He glanced at it, not intending to snoop, just curious. The notification said, "Pastor Sam, thanks for tonight." It meant a lot. Rick froze. Sharon wasn't the kind of woman who'd be texting the pastor late at night, at least not about anything that should have been private. Something about it didn't sit right, but Rick told himself he was overthinking it. He left the phone where it was and tried to push it out of his mind. The next day, though, the doubt lingered. He started noticing little things. A text she'd smile at before quickly locking her phone, or how she'd say she was going to church but come home hours later than usual. Rick didn't want to believe it, but the pieces weren't adding up. Then came the night everything changed. Sharon was in the living room, her voice hushed, talking to someone on the phone. Rick was in his workshop, which shared a thin wall with the living room. He wasn't eavesdropping, not at first. But then he heard her say, "I can't keep doing this, Sam. What if Rick finds out?" Rick's heart sank. He pressed his ear to the wall, straining to hear. Sharon's voice was shaky, almost pleading. "No, I didn't mean it like that. You know I care about you, but this is too much. I'm terrified he'll figure it out." Rick didn't hear the rest. He was too busy grappling with what those words meant. His wife, the woman he'd built a life with, was talking about him like he was an obstacle in her life. And with their pastor, of all people. The next morning, Rick confronted her. He didn't even wait for her to finish her coffee. "I heard you last night," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Talking to Sam. What's going on?" Sharon's face turned pale. You heard that," she stammered, setting her mug down so fast it spilled. "Rick, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Rick shot back, folding his arms. "Because what I think is that my wife is sneaking around with the pastor." "It's not sneaking around," she snapped, suddenly defensive. "We've just been talking. He's been helping me through some things." "Helping you? By making you lie to me? By meeting behind my back?" Rick's voice rose with every word. Sharon started crying, the kind of tears that made Rick question whether he was the bad guy for even asking. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "He was just there for me when you weren't. When I wasn't." Rick said, stunned. "I've been here the whole time. Working my butt off to give us a good life. And this is what I get." Sharon didn't have an answer. She just kept crying, repeating how sorry she was and how it wasn't what he thought. But Rick wasn't sure he believed her. He asked her outright if they'd slept together, and she swore they hadn't. But the hesitation in her voice, the way she avoided his eyes, it told him everything he needed to know. Rick spent the next few days in a fog. He couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, wondering how he'd missed the signs. But what haunted him most was the question of what to do next. Should he confront Pastor Sam? Should he tell the church? Or should he just walk away and let Sharon deal with the mess she'd made? A week later, Rick made a decision. He showed up at the church after hours, catching Sam alone in his office. "We need to talk," Rick said, his voice as cold as the January air outside. Sam tried to play it cool, acting like he didn't know what Rick was talking about. But when Rick laid out everything he'd overheard, Sam's mask slipped. "Rick, I think you're misunderstanding the situation," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Sharon and I have been praying together, that's all." "Praying," Rick repeated, his anger barely contained. "Is that what you call late-night phone calls and sneaking around? Praying?" Sam had no answer, just like Sharon hadn't. Rick didn't hit him, he wanted to, but he didn't. Instead he walked out, determined to leave both Sharon and the church behind. While Rick was wrestling with his wife's betrayal, I heard about another man's story that cut even deeper. This one came from a military sergeant named Logan, a guy who'd given everything for his country, only to have his personal life crumble in ways no battlefield ever prepared him for. Logan wasn't from our village, but his story reached me through a mutual friend. He was stationed overseas when the first whispers of trouble started. His wife, Melissa, had been distant during their calls, her replies shorter, her enthusiasm gone. At first, Logan chalked it up to the strain of deployment. He knew it wasn't easy being married to someone who was halfway across the world for months at a time. But then, his 8-year-old daughter Katie slipped up during one of their video calls. "Mommy's friend Craig came over again today," she said, her little voice cheerful and innocent. Logan's heart sank. Craig wasn't a name he recognized, and the way Katie said it, like it was someone she saw often, set off alarm bells. "Who's Craig?" Logan asked, keeping his tone light so Katie wouldn't sense his unease. "Oh, he's funny. He plays games with me while Mommy cooks," she said, giggling. "He's here a lot." Logan didn't ask Melissa about it right away. He wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. But as the days turned into weeks, his gut told him something was wrong. Melissa was posting less on social media, and when she did, The pictures felt staged, like she was trying too hard to show how normal things were. Finally, Logan couldn't take it anymore. He called one of his buddies back home, someone he trusted. "Can you do me a favor?" he asked, his voice low. "Drive by the house. See if you notice anything unusual." A week later, Logan got a call that changed everything. "There's a guy, man," his buddy said. "Truck parked in your driveway most nights. And it's not just parked there. He's staying over." Logan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He wanted to believe his buddy was mistaken, but deep down he knew. He confronted Melissa during their next video call, and she didn't even try to deny it. "It's not what you think," she said, her face a mix of anger and guilt. "Craig's just a friend. He's been helping out with the house." "Helping out?" Logan said, his voice trembling. "By sleeping over? By playing dad to our daughter?" Melissa rolled her eyes, the dismissive gesture cutting deeper than any words. "Logan, you've been gone for 2 years. What do you expect me to do? Sit around and wait forever?" Logan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I've been gone because I'm serving our country. Because I'm trying to provide for us. And what about me?" Melissa snapped. "What about what I need?" The conversation spiraled from there, turning into a shouting match that left Logan feeling more alone than ever. Melissa refused to admit to anything beyond an emotional connection, but Logan knew better. When his deployment ended a few months later, Logan came home to a house that no longer felt like his. Craig was gone by then. Melissa had ended things, or so she claimed, but the damage was done. Katie, too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, was caught in the middle. Logan told me his story over a beer at the local dive bar. "I gave her everything," he said, staring into his glass. "And she didn't even wait for me to come home. What are you gonna do now?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. "I filed for divorce," Logan said. "But it's not just about Melissa. It's about Katie. I'm not gonna let her grow up thinking this is how love works." By now, it felt like betrayal was in the air, touching everyone in some way. The next story hit close to home, involving a guy I'd known since high school. His name was Dave, and he was married to Lindsay. They were the kind of couple everyone envied, always laughing, always doing things together. But that image fell apart when Lindsay joined a co-ed baseball league. At first, Dave was all for it. Lindsay had been looking for a hobby, and he figured it'd be good for her to get out and socialize. But as the weeks went by, her enthusiasm for the league started to feel off. She'd come home late after post-game drinks and talk endlessly about one teammate in particular, a guy named Craig. Yeah, that Craig. Turns out, he wasn't just busy with Melissa from Logan's story. Craig was making the rounds in town, and Lindsay was the latest stop. Dave started noticing changes. Lindsay was glued to her phone, giggling at texts she'd claim were team strategies. She started dressing up more for games, wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. But the worst part? She wasn't interested in spending time with Dave anymore. Every weekend, she'd have some excuse, practice, a game, team bonding. One night, Dave decided to surprise her. He drove to the park where the team usually hung out after games. He spotted her sitting at a picnic table with Craig, their heads close together. It wasn't just the way they were talking, it was the way she looked at him, like Dave didn't even exist. When Lindsay got home that night, Dave confronted her. "What's going on with you and Craig?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. "He's just a friend. A friend you can't stop talking about? A friend you stay out all night with." Lindsay's face hardened. "Why are you being so insecure? It's just baseball, Dave. Can't I have a life outside of you?" Dave didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to believe her, but his gut told him not to. That weekend, he followed her to what she said was a team barbecue. Instead of a crowd of players, he found Craig's truck parked outside a motel. Lindsay's car was there too. "I wanted to burst in there and catch them," Dave told me later, his voice trembling with anger and sadness. "But then I thought, why? What would that change? I already knew." When Lindsay got home that night, Dave handed her a packed bag. "I know about the motel," he said. "And I know it wasn't just baseball." Lindsay's face crumpled. "Dave, I'm so sorry. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Dave cut her off. "You threw away our marriage for a guy who doesn't care about you. Pack your stuff and get out." By the time Dave's story reached me, he was living alone in the house they'd bought together. He'd cut ties with Lindsay completely, refusing to let her explain or try to fix things. She made her choice, he said when I asked if he'd ever take her back. Now she has to live with it. As for Craig, word about his escapades was spreading fast. I'd seen him around town a few times, always with a new woman on his arm. It was like he thrived on the chaos he left behind. With every new story, it felt like the trust holding people together was breaking apart, one thread at a time. And as I looked at my own life, I couldn't help but wonder, was I next? While the fallout from Craig's antics was rippling through town, my own life took a turn I didn't see coming. For the longest time, I'd thought I was one of the lucky ones. My wife, Camila, and I had been together for 12 years. She was my rock, my partner, the person I thought I knew better than anyone. But that illusion shattered one rainy Tuesday when I came home from a business trip a day early. I wasn't trying to catch her doing anything, I just wanted to surprise her. The trip had been exhausting, and all I could think about was coming home, having a quiet dinner, and spending time with my wife. But when I turned onto our street, there was a car in my driveway I didn't recognize. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind of car someone drives when they want to make an impression. My stomach twisted as I parked on the curb and got out of my truck. I stood there for a moment, staring at the car, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it belonged to a repairman, or maybe Camila had a friend over. But deep down I knew. I walked up to the front door and unlocked it as quietly as I could. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I made my way down the hall to our bedroom, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to see inside. There she was, Camila, lying in our bed with a man I didn't recognize. The sight was like a punch to the gut. My wife, with someone else, in the home we built together. I didn't barge in. I didn't yell. I didn't even move. I just stood there frozen, watching as they laughed and talked like they didn't have a care in the world. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually, I stepped back and left as quietly as I'd come. I drove around for hours, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers. But another part of me knew that no explanation would make it better. She'd made her choice, and I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. When I finally went back home, the sedan was gone. Camila was in the kitchen, acting like nothing had happened. "Hey, you're home early," she said, smiling like she hadn't just betrayed me. I didn't play along. "Who was he?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. Her smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Camila," I said. "I saw him. I saw you." She tried to deny it at first, but when I told her I'd seen everything, her excuses started pouring out. "It was a mistake," she said. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just... I don't know, Max. Things have been so hard lately." "Hard?" I said, my voice rising. "You mean for you? Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to give us this life?" She started crying, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I just felt numb. "I need you to leave," I said finally. "Pack a bag and go. We'll talk about the rest later." That night, I sat alone in the house, surrounded by all the memories we'd built together. It didn't feel real, like I was living someone else's life. The next morning, I called a lawyer. As I started putting the pieces together, I realized how blind I'd been. The signs had been there, the late nights, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she'd been pulling away. But I'd ignored them because I wanted to believe we were different. That we were better. We weren't. The morning after I found out about Camila, I felt like I was walking through a fog. I kept going over the details in my head, trying to piece together what I'd missed. The way she'd started staying late at work. The nights she claimed she was out with her friends, but came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. I'd convinced myself it was nothing, but now I couldn't ignore the truth staring me in the face. I met with a lawyer that afternoon. His office was small, cluttered with papers, and smelled faintly of coffee. "Divorce isn't easy," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But if you've already decided this is what you want, we can get started." "I have," I said firmly, though my stomach churned at the words. Over the next week, I stayed busy gathering everything I'd need: bank statements, property documents, even screenshots of text messages I'd found on Camila's phone. She didn't bother trying to hide anything after our confrontation. Maybe she thought it didn't matter anymore, or maybe she thought I'd forgive her. But I couldn't. One night, while I was packing some of her things, she came into the room. "Max, can we talk?" she asked softly, standing in the doorway like she didn't know whether to come in or stay out. I didn't look at her. "What's there to talk about?" She sighed, stepping closer. "I made a mistake. A huge one. But I still love you. Can't we work through this?" I put down the box I was holding and finally looked at her. "You don't love me, Camila. If you did, you wouldn't have done what you did. Love doesn't destroy people." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the man in my bed, the lies she told, and the way she'd laughed with him like I didn't exist. "You've already made your choice," I said. "Now I'm making mine." Camila didn't say anything else. She just nodded, grabbed the box I'd packed for her, and left the room. That was the last time we spoke before she moved out. The fallout wasn't just personal. Word spread fast in a small town like ours, and before long, everyone knew about what had happened. People started treating me differently, some with pity, others with curiosity, like they were waiting to see how I'd handle the situation. One night at the diner, Tim, Johnny, and Rick joined me at my usual booth. They didn't say much at first, just sat there drinking coffee like it was any other night. Finally, Tim spoke up. "How you holding up, Max?" I shrugged. "I'm surviving." Johnny leaned forward, his face a mix of frustration and understanding. "You're stronger than I was. I let it eat me alive for weeks before I did anything about it." Rick nodded, stirring his coffee absently. "Same here. Took me too long to see things for what they were." Their words hit me harder than I expected. These were men who'd been through hell, just like I was. And while their stories weren't exactly the same as mine, the pain was familiar. "Thanks," I said quietly. "But honestly, I don't feel strong. I feel empty." Tim clapped me on the shoulder. "That's normal, man. But you're doing the right thing. You can't let her walk all over you." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. As the divorce moved forward, I found myself leaning on those guys more than I ever expected. They didn't have all the answers, but they understood in a way no one else could. And though I wasn't sure where my life was headed, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Camila's betrayal define me, so I was trying to pick up the pieces. The fiancé, the guy who'd hired a private investigator, came to me with an update on his situation. He'd gotten the proof he needed, and it was worse than he imagined. He met me at the diner late one evening, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual clean-cut appearance was gone, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a weariness that seemed to weigh down his every move. "It's bad, Max," he said, stirring a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "Worse than I thought." "What did the PI find?" I asked. He pulled out a folder, thick with photos, screenshots, and reports. "She's been seeing this guy for months," he said. "Every Thursday, like clockwork." The cafe was just the start. "They've been going to hotels, Max. And not just one guy. Turns out there's another one too, a coworker." I didn't know what to say. He flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. His fiancée holding hands with a man outside a motel, kissing him in a car, walking into her coworker's apartment late at night. "Have you confronted her yet?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Not yet," he said, his voice shaking. "I wanted to be sure I had everything. Now I do." That weekend, he finally sat her down. He told me later how it played out. He laid the photos in front of her on the coffee table, one by one. "Explain these," he said, his voice cold. She stared at them, her face pale, her hands trembling. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. "Not what it looks like," he said, his voice rising. "So what, these are just coincidences? You accidentally kissed this guy? Accidentally went to a motel with him?" Tears started streaming down her face, but he wasn't moved. "How long?" he demanded. "How long have you been lying to me?" 6 months, she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "But it didn't mean anything. I love you. I never stopped loving you." Her words only made him angrier. "You love me," he said, laughing bitterly. "You sure have a funny way of showing it." She tried to justify it, saying she was stressed, that their relationship had grown stale, that she didn't know how to stop once it started. But every word out of her mouth felt like another knife in his back. "You've ruined everything," he said finally, his voice breaking. "The wedding, the life we were supposed to have, It's all gone because of you. He called off the engagement the next day. She tried to reach out, to apologize, to beg for another chance, but he blocked her on everything. I'm done, he told me. I can't marry someone who could do this to me. As I listened to his story, I couldn't help but see the parallels with my own. The lies, the betrayal, the way someone you thought you knew could turn into a stranger overnight. It was a painful reminder that no one was immune, not me, not him, not anyone. And though I felt for him, I also saw a bit of hope in his resolve. He wasn't letting her take more from him than she already had. And maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. As the fiancé dealt with the fallout from his broken engagement, the stories around town seemed to keep getting messier. It wasn't just individual betrayals anymore. It was like everyone's secrets were weaving together into one tangled web. And at the center of it all? Craig. By now, it was clear that Craig wasn't just some random guy. He was a pattern. A problem. A homewrecker who'd worked his way through more marriages and relationships than anyone could keep track of. What started with Logan's Melissa and Dave's Lindsay had spiraled into something bigger. Every few days, it seemed like someone new was sharing a story that ended with, and then I found out she was seeing Craig. One night, I ran into Logan at the bar. He was nursing a beer, staring at the television like it held the answers to all his problems. Did you hear? He asked when I sat down beside him. Hear what? I asked. Craig's in the hospital, he said, not looking away from the screen. Someone jumped him outside the grocery store last night. I didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, it was hard to muster sympathy for a guy who destroyed so many lives. But on the other hand, taking matters into your own hands like that didn't sit right with me. Do they know who did it? I asked. Logan shrugged. Probably one of the guys he messed with. The way I see it, he had it coming. The next morning, I was getting coffee at the diner when Rick came in. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. You all right? I asked as he slid into the booth across from me. Rick shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. Sharon's been talking to Craig, he said. Wait, what? I said, nearly spilling my coffee. After everything? Rick nodded. I found texts on her phone. She's been visiting him in the hospital. Says she feels sorry for him, that he's misunderstood. That guy is poison, Rick, I said. You know that. Yeah, he said, rubbing his temples. But Sharon doesn't see it that way. She thinks I'm the bad guy for not forgiving her, for not trusting her after everything. What are you gonna do? I asked. Rick looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. I don't know, he said. But I'm not gonna let her make me feel like this anymore. That evening, I got a call from Johnny. He'd been keeping his distance from Jessica since their confrontation, but something new had come up. She's been seeing Craig too, he said, his voice tight with anger. I thought I was crazy, Max, but it's all there in her phone. She's been sneaking off to the hospital to see him. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. What is it with this guy? Johnny let out a bitter laugh. I don't know, but it's like he's got some kind of hold on these women. I'm done though. I'm packing my stuff tonight. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was shifting. Craig had become a symbol of everything wrong in our small town, a walking reminder of how trust could be so easily broken. And yet, some people still defended him, still made excuses for their choices. The cracks in the town's foundation were becoming harder to ignore. Everyone's secrets were spilling out, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The fallout from Craig's escapades reached a boiling point just as I was starting to find my footing again. With Camila out of the house and the divorce papers in motion, I thought I was finally moving forward. But the way everything around me was unraveling made it impossible to feel settled. The breaking point came at the town's annual community meeting. It's one of those small-town traditions where everyone gathers at the school gym to discuss things like budgets, upcoming events, and whatever rumors are circulating. Normally, it's boring, a lot of nodding, smiling, and agreeing to whatever the town council suggests. But not this time. The tension was palpable as soon as I walked in. People were huddled in small groups, whispering furiously. It didn't take long to figure out why. Word had spread about Craig's hospital visit and the fights his name had sparked in nearly every corner of town. And for the first time, people were pointing fingers, not just at him but at each other. The meeting started off calmly enough, with the council going through their usual motions. But then someone, Rick of all people, stood up. We need to address the elephant in the room, he said, his voice steady but loud enough to echo through the gym. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. What are you referring to, Rick? One of them asked. I'm talking about Craig, Rick said, and the mess he's made in this town. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, like they wanted nothing to do with the conversation. It's not just Craig's fault, Rick continued. It's all of us. The lies, the secrets, it's tearing this place apart. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on a few familiar faces, including mine. How many more marriages have to fall apart before we wake up and realize what's happening here? Tim stood up next, his face red with anger. You think it's that simple, Rick? You think blaming Craig fixes everything? The guy's a snake, but the people who let him into their lives, they made their choices too. Sharon, sitting a few rows behind Tim, burst into tears. It's not that simple, she cried. Sometimes you just what? Tim cut her off. Just fall into bed with someone? Just lie to the people who love you. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting over each other, airing grievances that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, maybe even years. Accusations flew, alliances crumbled, and by the end of the night, it felt like no one in the town trusted anyone anymore. When I got home, I sat on my couch, staring at the ceiling. The meeting had been a disaster, but it was also a wake-up call. Rick was right. Craig wasn't the root of the problem. He was just the spark that ignited a fire already smoldering beneath the surface. I thought about Camila, about how we'd once been so happy and in sync, only to let distance and miscommunication drive us apart. I thought about Tim, Johnny, and the others, each of them struggling to make sense of the betrayals they'd faced. And I thought about Craig, lying in his hospital bed, probably smiling to himself at the chaos he'd caused. It was clear now, the only way out of this mess was through it. There was no going back to how things were. We had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was, and decide what kind of people we wanted to be moving forward. The town had hit rock bottom after that meeting. Relationships were shattered, trust was non-existent, and everyone was pointing fingers. But in the days that followed, something unexpected began to happen. People started talking. Not the hushed behind closed doors kind of talking, but real honest conversations, the kind where the truth finally comes out. It started with Rick. He showed up at the diner one morning, Sharon in tow. Their faces were tired, but there was something different about them, a determination I hadn't seen before. Rick stood at the counter, cleared his throat, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I've been holding on to a lot of anger, he said. At Sharon. At Craig. At myself. But I'm done letting it control me. Sharon looked down at her hands, tears welling in her eyes. I made mistakes, she said, her voice trembling. Big ones. But I want to make things right. And I'm starting by telling the truth. No more hiding. Their words seemed to ripple through the diner. Tim, sitting in his usual booth, nodded slowly. Johnny, who'd been staring out the window, turned around, his expression unreadable. Even I felt something shift inside me, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could move forward. Over the next week, others followed Rick and Sharon's lead. Tim met with Candy, not to reconcile but to lay everything on the table. I needed to hear her say it, he told me later. And I needed to say what I was feeling, too. It didn't fix anything, but it gave me closure. Johnny started packing up his house, preparing for a fresh start in a neighboring town. I can't stay here, he admitted. Too many memories. But I'm taking the lessons with me. As for the fiancé, he confronted his ex one last time, not to fight but to let her know he was moving on. She doesn't get to have power over me anymore, he said. The biggest surprise came from Camila. One evening, she showed up at my door, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Max, she said, I don't expect you to forgive me. I need to apologize. I didn't invite her in, but I listened as she spoke. She admitted to everything, how she'd let herself drift away, how she'd sought validation from someone else when our marriage felt stagnant. It wasn't your fault, she said, tears streaming down her face. I made my choices, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life. When she was done, I thanked her for her honesty and told her I wished her well. But we're done, I said. You know that, right? She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. And I'm sorry it took me losing you to realize what I had. By the end of the month, The dust was finally starting to settle. Craig had been discharged from the hospital and quietly left town, his reputation in ruins. People were still rebuilding trust, lives, themselves, but there was a sense of progress, of healing. One evening, I met up with Tim, Johnny, and Rick at the bar. We sat in our usual corner, nursing beers and swapping stories. For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed. It wasn't the kind of laughter that erases pain, but the kind that acknowledges it and says, "We're still here." "I don't know what's next," I admitted, staring into my glass. "But I know one thing, I'm not letting this define me." Tim raised his beer. "To moving forward." Johnny and Rick joined in, their glasses clinking together. "To moving forward," we echoed. And in that moment, I realized that even though life had knocked us down, it hadn't broken us. We'd learned, grown, and found strength we didn't know we had. And maybe, just maybe, we'd come out of this stronger than before.